over one of the words of us and the stuff so that we can get to see how like to the other one?
Sure. You want me to do an example one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in this situation, we know that the layers that came to the bottom of the lake were piling up over time. So this bottom layer is the oldest, and then they get younger and younger until you get to the top, and that's the youngest. So an important piece of information is that pollen by itself is not useful to us unless we collected it out of a lake sediment core like this, where we know how old it is. So here's another picture of a sediment core. Sediment cores are dust, pollen, dead things that pile up at the bottom of the lake. And then we go drill a sample of it, and we know that the bottom part is old, and the top part is young, and the pollen that we find in the certain areas tells us about the climate. So I'm going to move on now from pollen. Does anybody have any questions about pollen? Does everybody understand how it tells us about climate? Does everybody understand how it tells us about time?
What, pollen?
Yeah. How do we know what time period the pollen came from?
Because
How deep it is. So where do we collect the pollen from?
the lake.
The bottom of the lake.
But also
Or
like,
someplace where humans haven't messed with it, right? Because we need the layers. Make sense? Okay, so when I ask you what's one type of proxy data, an appropriate answer would be fossil pollen, Masigas. Fossil pollen is one type of proxy data. Understand? So lakes collect things at the bottom, but also the ocean is a good place where we collect samples to learn about past climate. And we do it in a very similar way. We go out in a boat, and we drop this drill thing out over the side down to the bottom, and we drill out a core sample. The difference is, this is a much bigger boat because the ocean is much deeper. Make sense? So they need bigger equipment to drill a core out of the bottom of the ocean than they need to get out of the bottom of the lake because the ocean is deeper. But they do the same thing. They pull this core sample out, they cut it in half so they can see the layers, and they examine, the top is the new stuff, the bottom is the old stuff, and they look at specific layers to figure out what was in those specific layers so they know what the climate was like. But when we look at stuff out of the bottom of an ocean, we're not going to find pollen. I don't know if you know this, but pollen doesn't really make it out to the middle of the ocean. It would get eaten or something. It wouldn't make it that far. So what we look at in the lake or in the deep sea sediment cores are things like this. So this right here that I'm pointing at is called a foraminifera. And it's a little tiny animal. They call it plankton. Plankton is a generic word for little tiny animals in the ocean. And can you tell by looking at this, this is a microscope picture? Like this is really tiny, and they zoomed in for us. So these things that they look for in the dirt are very small. So they look at them under a microscope, which is similar to pollen. We have to look at the pollen under a microscope to see it, right? So deep sea sediment cores are another way we learn about climate, and it's very similar to the pollen stuff. We drill a core, we look through the layers, we look under a microscope, but the difference is we aren't looking for pollen in the ocean, we're looking for these things, and I just told you what they're called. They're called foraminifera, but we call them forams for short, because foraminifera is long and hard to say.
could you do it?
So here's another picture of what they look like. They're these little tiny shelled creatures. See it?
That's nasty.
And the thing that's really cool about these creatures and why they're useful to us is that they have a shell that's made out of a chemical that grows differently in different temperatures. So if their shells are swirling around this way, which is clockwise, that tells us that that shell formed when the water was a certain temperature that was warm. I'm making this number up, but maybe it was like 52 degrees. And if the under 51 degrees, then the chemicals in their shells actually form the other direction. And so they would swirl counterclockwise instead of clockwise. So the moral of the story is the direction of the shells of these little creatures can tell us whether it was warm or cold in the ocean when they were alive. Does that make sense? And then they die, and they fall to the bottom of the ocean, and they get buried in the layers, and they can be seen when we dig out the sample core, just like the pollen. Yes, sir?
Like coral, because I've heard of bunch of stuff on like nature channels, like there's this like every full moon, like these coral activities and stuff like that.
Yeah, so there's coral in the shallower parts of the ocean. They don't live out as deep as these. And we can study coral. For one thing, we're seeing coral get bleached, which basically means the water got too acidic and they all started to die. And another thing that we can do with coral is we can analyze it in a mass spectrometer, which I'll talk about soon, to find out what kind of isotopes it's made of, and we can learn about the climate that way. So, when I ask you what's a second type of proxy data, an accurate answer would be Masigas deep sea sediments, or Masigas forams, are a second type of proxy data. Excuse me. And they tell us the climate by which direction their shells are swirling. One direction tells us warm, the other direction tells us cold. And they tell us the time because we dig them up out of these sediment cores in the bottom of the ocean, and the deeper down in the layers they are, the older they are. So now I'm going to talk about the third type of proxy data, which is tree rings. And I am assuming that you know a little bit about tree rings, so I'm going to go through this a little faster. Tree rings can tell us about past climate because trees grow better when they get more water, and they don't grow as well when they get less water.
What are tree rings?
So this is a picture of a tree that got cut down. And you see how every year there's like a stripe on the trunk of this tree? Those are called tree rings. And what happens is every single year, trees grow, they grow more in the spring when they get lots of rain. And then they slow down and they protect themselves in the winter when it's like colder and they have to hunker down and make it through the winter. And so you'll see this pattern where you'll have lots of growth, that's the light part, and then the dark stripe is like the fall when it's protecting itself. And so we can count these stripes. So the combination of the thin, or the yellow part and the brown part, that's 1 year. And if we count them, we can see how many years old this tree is. And so tree rings are cool because we can get a more specific or targeted time period, and we can know something about the climate. I'm going to go forward and then backward again. So tree rings that are close together tells us that it was drier weather, was not great conditions for trees to grow. And tree rings that are farther apart are wetter weather. They caught lots of rain and it was good growing conditions. So I'm going to go back and show you again this picture. So this ring right here they're farther apart. It's a thicker ring, and that's evidence that this tree got lots of water that year and it grew a lot. Whereas these rings over here, see how skinny they are? So that's evidence that this tree was not getting as much water at the time, and so it wasn't able to grow each year as much, which is why those rings are so close together. So thicker rings, more water, thinner rings, less water. Make sense? Okay. So the other thing is we can actually count how far back in time we're going because you can count each ring. So again, this proxy data has to tell me two things. One, it needs to tell me about the climate, and two, it needs to tell me about the time. So in this one, these rings are so close together that somebody used a microscope to count them for us, and they're telling us that if I counted from the outside to here, that's 550 rings. And then I could keep counting and I'd find out that this tree is about 598 years old. So if I cut this tree down today, and I was counting it, then this is the year 2016, and I would count back, that's 550 years ago, 551 years ago, 552 years ago, 553 years ago. Make sense?
Yeah.
So I could estimate when this climate changed. Can you see that these rings are all thin, 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 thin?
Yeah.
Thin, 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 thin. And right here is where they switch from being thin to being thick. Can you see it?
Yeah.
So I know that this year right here is where the climate changed and it became wetter. These are wetter years where the tree grew more, and these are drier. Make sense? So there's some cool stuff we can find out from tree rings that's a little more specific. One, instead of looking at like the last 10,000 years, we're only looking at the last 600 years. And there's good things and bad things about that. So a good thing is we can be really specific. I know exactly what year this was. But the bad thing is I can't go as far back in time because this tree only lived 600 years, and so I can't go any further back than that. Does that make sense? So tree rings can tell us how old the tree is because each ring is 1 year. If it was cut down today, we could count back and figure out what year it was planted. And it can tell us when it was good growing conditions and when it was bad, because the thick rings mean it was good, and the thin rings mean it was bad. Any questions about tree rings? Yeah.
Are there specific trees you can look up?
Yeah, so all trees have rings in them, but some trees are easier to see the rings. And the ones that we find the most useful are the redwood trees that grow in the California forests. And the reason that we like those trees is because they've been there for a very long time without being cut down. And so we tend to use those instead of smaller trees because they haven't lived as long. One other thing people ask all the time is, Ms. Egas, isn't it bad to go cut down a tree to study the tree rings?
Yes.
Yeah, we're not trying to kill the tree to study the tree rings. So they actually have a tool. And it's a lot like a corkscrew or like a little tiny drill. And they can drill a core sample out of the tree and pull out just this little skinny strip so they can see the stripes and the layers all the way to the center of the tree without actually hurting or killing the tree. They just put a little putty over the hole when they're done so bugs can't get in there. And they can study the tree rings without cutting the whole tree down. Does that make sense? Alright, so that was the third of 5. And just so you know, if you want a C on your summative, you're going to tell me about 3 different types of proxy data. So maybe tree rings, lake cores, and deep sea sediments are the 3 you tell me about. But if you want a B or an A, you're going to need to know about these last 2. Back on the slide.
Tree rings. One that says rings close together. Yellow.
Rings close together, which is thin rings, are drier weather. And rings farther apart, thick rings, are wetter. Does that logically make sense to you? A tree gets more water, it grows fatter.
How does it grow fat?
So trees use the carbon dioxide in the air and the water to combine and make their tree stuff. Like the cellulose they're actually made of is built out of those things, right? And so if they get more water, they can build more tree.
Oh.
Just like if I eat more food, I get fatter, right?
Okay.
Same idea. Okay, so we're on to number 4, which is carbonate. And this is the one that was very heavily focused on the field trip. So it's review for people who are on the field trip and news to people who weren't. So carbonate is a mineral that forms in soils, and you can find it all around the world. And it looks